Hello and welcome to this section. In this section, let's learn about the use of triggers. In this section, we mainly include the following knowledge points. First, the common functions and use scenarios of triggers. Finally, we will cooperate with a case to teach you how to use our triggers. First of all, the first point is the common feature of triggers. Before explaining the common feature, we go to the editor to find our triggers. Let's open the editor and change the application name to Trigger, and then create the top-level one. Similarly, we can add a page under Frontend first, and then add our trigger under the page. Where is the departure date? As we can see, it is actually a bad idea for our layout widget. Here is an hourglass-shaped widget, and the method of adding our trigger is very simple. We only need to click our trigger to add it to the number of our objects when the parent object is selected. Trigger has such several properties. First, it is a number of times it plays. This property determines how many times our trigger will play in total. By default, it is an infinite number of times when we do not write. If you want it to play a fixed number of times, you can fill in the numbers here. The second point is its time interval. When you don't fill it in by default, it defaults that each needle will be triggered once, and this needle is different from its equipment, so the trigger efficiency of different people's mobile phones is also different. Of course, you can fill in the unit here. If you fill in a number, its default unit is seconds, so it is according to you fill in the numbers at such an equal interval for a penalty. Then the third property is an autoplay meaning, that is, you don't need to trigger the play event of such a trigger through the event, and it will automatically trigger such a trigger when you finish loading. Then finally, there is a process of animation optimization, that is, if you use triggers to trigger a series of animation effects, a series of effects will be optimized. Let's move on to one of its common features. The first is that the trigger is an instant trigger widget, which is used to repeatedly trigger an event or an animation effect at an equal time interval. When the time interval is short enough, it can also be in a continuous penalty. Then, the second point, trigger can set the trigger times and time interval to adapt to different trigger methods. Therefore, the definition of trigger is very, very simple. So let's take a look at some applicable scenarios. It mainly includes the following scenarios. The first point is timing and delay triggering. After using the trigger, you can realize a single delay start of an action. For example, if we want an action or an event to be executed, and then delay 2 seconds to trigger, we can use the trigger to do it. Since we have not yet learned the action school, I will show you a similar function here. When we come to our editor, we will create a new page, and then we will modify the background color of page 1 to turn it into a pink, and then modify the background of page 2 to turn it into such a green. Let's add a button in page 1, and then this button is called delayed page turning, and then we will turn the page for delayed page turning such a button to add its event. Then the same top-level event, you add event for it. What do we do when it is clicked? We just go straight to him to perform an action. What action? Just let our trigger let him play a play. Pay attention, so that it can play a play during the trigger period. Then, because the trigger period itself has a certain time interval and playback times, here we can set the playback times of a trigger to once and the time interval to 2 seconds. What effect will this have? It will trigger such a trigger after 2 seconds, and then we add 1 for the trigger event. The trigger event only has one trigger called our trigger, so every time he triggers to trigger, he will execute one of these events. What do we want him to do? So our front end to perform a jump page operation, let it jump to our page 2, let's preview to see an effect. When we click the delay page turning, we can see that he had a translation effect after 2 seconds, so this is the effect that we use the trigger to do our single delay trigger. Here I will give you a detailed explanation. On this side, we use such an event. First, we use the event to let us trigger the trigger has a play, and then we set its property for the trigger to play once, and its time interval is 2 seconds, so it will trigger its own such a trigger event in 2 seconds. What is its trigger event? It is to let the front end jump to a page 2, so the overall triggering result is that when we click this button, it will let such a trigger to trigger, and then because its property has set a time interval of 2 seconds, so after 2 seconds, it will execute a triggering event, and then jump to a page 2. This is the first usage scenario of the trigger, which is our timing and our delay penalty. Then there is the second time scenario, that is, starting at an equal time interval. For a time trigger at an equal time interval, it will be more convenient to use the trigger than the time axis. The time axis is also a knowledge point we will learn later. You can ignore it for the time being. For example, in our application, we want to perform an automatic page flipping effect every 3 seconds, and we can use triggers to do it. So we have to start every 3 seconds to play every 3 seconds, and then trigger one of our page flipping operations at the same time. How can we do this? I will give you a demonstration in the application. Yes, in this way, we have a lot of a series of pages. Then, what operation should we perform next? When we click this button, we need such a trigger to trigger. How many pages will it turn in this trigger period? Let's see, 123, so it will turn 3 pages, right? So we changed the number of such a play word to 3 times, so that he would turn over 3 pages. I still don't need to change the click event here. When he clicks, he can let such a trigger play. What are we going to modify? It is a trigger, such as a trigger, that triggers an event. If we go to trigger such an event now, what is it? But every time when the trigger is triggered, let the front end jump to page 2, then he will always jump to this page, so there is no effect. So what should we do? We have changed such an event into a jump to the next page. Due to the action of jumping to the next page, if you jump to page 2 on page 1, if you already jumped to page 3 on page 2, you have completed an effect of automatic page turning. Let's have a look at the effect. Then click a delayed page turning. You can see that it will jump to the next page and page after 2 seconds, and then 1 or 2. We can find out why such a trigger has not been triggered again. Here we need to make it clear to you, because where do I put our trigger? It's under our page 1, so when he jumps to page 2, how's the whole page 1? Is there no page 1? Therefore, such a trigger period will naturally disappear. Since he is absent, he has no way to trigger again. So if we want to achieve such a flipping sub-effect, we need to put such a trigger under the front end to ensure that it will not be destroyed because of the page. Okay, let's preview again to see an effect. Then we click a delay trigger. 1 or 2, you can see that he jumps to the page now. Then in 2 seconds, you can see that he jumps to a new page again. Then in 2 seconds, he jumps to a new page again. So now it implements an operation that we wait for the time interval to automatically turn the page make. Then the trigger has a third function, which is our continuous trigger. For example, it provides a continuous trigger function with equal time interval of 1 frame. Therefore, for which devices, its refresh frequency is different, so it can display a different effect. So for us, as long as we set each frame to start, it is completely continuous for our naked eyes, so we can achieve a lot of continuous animation effects. However, since such a continuous start is mostly used in conjunction with our animation effects, such a continuous trigger, when we are marketing interactive topics, we will come to talk about the use of our continuous trigger. Then we will cooperate with some use methods of trigger. Let's talk about an application, that is, we will press a second to explain such an application. Let's take a look at its effect first. This is an application of pressing a second. We can see that when I press the trigger, it will move, and then when I release it, it will move, it will stop, and then tell me the result of 1 click. When we click again, it will time again. Then when I release it, it will display a result for us. Then you see, I release it again, and then he will tell us a different result. Let's make such a small game with 1 second press consolidate the use of triggers we learned. Then first of all, we can create a new case here and change its name to next second. In fact, absolute positioning can be used here. I think absolute positioning may be a little more convenient. Here we can directly click absolute positioning. Then we add a page under the front end, and the UI is very simple after pressing it for a second. It is just a result of a prompt, then a display time and a button below. Then we will do it here in turn. The first is the result of a prompt. Let's select the page and add a text. For example, your second is too long. Yes, it's almost like this. Then, it's displayed in the middle, and then it's displayed in a time. Then, we can write it a little for him, and then if you say this it's 12.23 seconds, right, and then perform a display in a play. The font size here can be slightly larger. Let's assume a larger font size here, and then a button is needed below. We can replace this button with a button. For example, change the name of such a button to press or press, and then change one of its font sizes slightly larger, size 48, and then we turn it into a circle. How can it become a circle? Let's first set the width and height of the bar the same. For example, we need a 120 pixel here, slightly centered, and then we change the rounded corner of the frame below. If it is 120 pixels, you fill half of its width and height in the border fillet here, that is, our 60 pixels, and it will automatically become a circle. Of course, you don't have to fill in items here. It's the same with filling in 5% and 10, because it will automatically help you calculate its width and height, and then we'll do it one by one. Then we will do a logical event for us, and add one of our protagonists under our page, which is our trigger. Then because we use a time variable here, we must display some values, so we add another value variable on the page, which is called our time length here, and then we can start to do an event when the preparations are ready. First of all, when we press our fingers, we must do one thing, that is, what does it want our trigger to do? Have a play, right? Then when the trigger is playing, what event does it have to do? Then we can cut it into the trigger. What if such a trigger is triggered and it is played? We will assign a value to a duration like ours. We can see that there are a series of trigger-related properties in the drop-down menu of trigger, including our trigger times, refresh interval, and start time. The so-called starting time is how much time it has gone through since its departure. Therefore, for us, we need to make a positive timing. Whether we can get such a starting time is enough. Therefore, here we choose to open the market in the drop-down menu, and then the same time has been done. So do we want to correct what about an operation to perform an assignment for a time display on our side? So similarly, when it is triggered, we also perform an assignment operation on our text. What is its assignment equal to? In fact, it is equal to a content of our time length. This is equal to a value of our time length. We can preview the effect first. When I press my finger, look at the duration here. It has an effect of assignment. So when our fingers leave, should we let this trigger pause, or even reset it? So here we go to add a new trigger event, that is, when our fingers leave, what should we do? Let us have a trigger to perform a reset effect. Let's have a look at the preview. The fingers press to start and the fingers leave in time, so that we can see that they are reset, and then it is fixed here for such a time when we press it again, it will retime, and then when we leave again, a market appears here, so we have completed a display of the most basic time, that is, we will get how long our fingers have gone through the process of pressing, but what else should we do after such a time? What's the matter? Should we also assign a value to a text like us when our fingers leave? So here we still need to add the conditional judgment we learned in the last class. We can judge it here, that is, if we have a value of a duration, we can make it a little simpler here. We take 0.8 seconds as the first time interval, so what do we do when its duration is less than 0.8? We make an assignment to a text like ours. What is the assignment? Your vaccine is too short. Then we can copy and paste the same one, and then change the conditions here to what? Change to the rest. Why should I change to the rest? You can think about it, that is, if this thing is triggered, it will not go down, so I can directly ask him to write a mutually exclusive relationship here. So next, let's make it greater than 0.8, and its duration is less than 1.2. Then we say that your vaccine is too accurate, right? Then we can add another condition here. We can directly copy and paste this one, and here we will have another one. In the other case, it is the duration of the vaccine. If the length is always greater than 1.2, we know what it is. Even your vaccine is too long. Okay, let's preview it to see the effect. Next, when I click, we release it. Oh sorry, we copied it here and made a mistake. We reset the value of the time variable. We should copy our prompt text here. Let's take a look again. Your vaccine is too long. Let's make it shorter. You see, your vaccine is too short for 0.64 seconds. Then we are more accurate, and your vaccine is too accurate. You can see that our game is basically ready to play, and then we can optimize some details. For example, at the beginning when you see the text here, it should be a prompt text, right? Change the name here to prompt text, and then type the same, but at the moment we click and press, should this text be restored to our prompt text, so we assign a value to this prompt text, which is equal to our prompt text, and let it perform an assignment operation. It is not such a time at the beginning, it is 0, because it doesn't have time at first, and then we'll preview to see if there's anything else to make a change. When we click, it's too accurate to release your vaccine. Let's click a little bit shorter, and your vaccine is too short. Then when we press a little longer, your vaccine is too long, so we complete a function of pressing and holding for 1 second. Then I will take you to review what is the core of pressing and holding for 1 second. That is, we use a function called start time length in the trigger. In the drop-down menu, it has a trigger number, which is how many times it has triggered here. Then the refresh interval is the first refresh interval we set, and the start time length is an event we have experienced since it triggered. But if we do a positive timing here, in fact, we all start to do it. Because our trigger period will perform a trigger function every frame, so we copy the time as the start time, and we complete a timing feature here. Let's judge the duration and the one we stipulate a size of the range, and then let it display a different content, so that we have completed the production of a small game such as pressing 1 second. That's all the content of this section. Thank you for watching.